Welcome to Haven Horizons Lunch and Learn. Welcome to Haven Horizons Lunch and Learn Spring Series. I'm Madeleine McAleer, CEO of Haven Horizons. Haven Horizons is a national domestic abuse prevention centre, and our Lunch and Learn spotlight sessions identify gaps in the response to domestic, sexual and gender-based abuse, and then we propose actionable solutions. So this Spring Series 2026, as most of you know, is focusing on the lack of domestic abuse media reporting guidelines. So today, Sarah Harte, the Planning and Communication Strategist with Haven Horizons, is in conversation with Dr. Susan Leahy. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks very much, Madeleine. Susan Leahy is a professor in the School of Law at the University of Limerick. She is the director of the Centre for Crime, Justice and Victim Studies, a research centre at the university. She is also a co-founder and co-director of the All-Ireland Network for Sexual Violence Research. Susan researches on sexual violence, domestic abuse, and the rights of victims of crime. She has published her research in several books and in national and international peer-reviewed journals. She has also completed several funded research projects on sexual violence, including empirical research in Irish rape trials funded by the Irish Research Council, conducted in partnership with Dublin Rape Crisis Centre. Another project she worked on created guidance for print media reporting on sexual violence, funded by the Irish Research Council, conducted in partnership with the Sexual Violence Centre Cork. She is currently working on a Coalesce funded project which focuses on the victim survivors' lived experiences of sexual offence trials. It's great to have you here, Susan.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Not at all. So I just wanted to ask you first, what was it first that drew you to the issue of how media reports on sexual violence? What was the starting point for your research?
That's a really good question. And I suppose when I think back on it, it surprises me that it took me so long to get to this topic, because I've been researching in this area for actually nearly 20 years now, since I started my PhD, and so much of my work is about the societal I suppose attitudes, societal context in which sexual violence occurs, how that impacts on the trial process, work around rape myths and how they impact on, for example, how, I suppose, first of all, whether people are likely to report, and then how their reports are received within the criminal justice system. And I also had a keen interest in media. So at one time I dreamed of being a journalist. I studied journalism for a year. I've taught media law in UL for over a decade now. And it really wasn't until the rugby rape trial in Belfast that I really started to think about media reporting in this context. I think there was a really sustained media coverage at the time. I've been invited to speak at Queen's University Belfast on the differences between Ireland and Northern Ireland in terms of how trials operate. So, the public being able to go to the trials at the time in Northern Ireland, the defendants not having anonymity. And as part of that, then I started to naturally think about media reporting. And I was invited to contribute a chapter to a book which ultimately turned into looking at media reporting. And then I started to see, well, in all other jurisdictions, well, a lot of other jurisdictions, a lot of comparable jurisdictions, there was guidance for media reporting, that all other stakeholders that are involved with victim survivors or involved with sexual violence had, I suppose, some guidance, some, I suppose, rule books to operate by, and media really didn't. And I suppose at the outset, it's important for me to say that I come to this from having a healthy awareness of how media operates, that they have a very important job to do. And I think that over the years, media have done fundamentally important work in highlighting the cause of sexual violence, and shining a light on challenges in the system. But I think there's definitely been slippages over the years as well, and things that can be done better. So I came from it from a place of what could we do to support media in doing the difficult job of reporting responsibly in this area.
So when you're thinking about that there, I mean, you've covered quite a lot there, and obviously the Belfast rugby rape trial really blew the lid off in so many different ways with regard to media reporting and maybe sort of a societal awareness of some of the attitudes that were out there that we mightn't have been that aware of. Just to focus a little bit more, what would you say would have been the gaps, the specific gaps? You covered quite a lot there. You talked about the trial process and societal attitudes. What would the specific gaps that would have been top of your list that you thought, okay, if we want to support media in reporting on sexual violence, what were the main gaps for you that you saw at the time that you kind of commenced this work?
I suppose there were a few, and some of them are more difficult to, I suppose, overcome than others. I suppose reporting on sexual violence is necessarily episodic. It responds to cases that are happening at a point in time. There is necessarily a choice in what cases are covered and which cases are not. Certain cases will attract more attention than others. But I suppose we need to be very mindful of where people receive their wisdom on sexual violence often will come from media. So some things that I suppose over the years have concerned me is one, the level of detail in reports, and I think there was a very interesting case in the report in the Irish Times on that very topic from a court reporter
That's
yesterday or this week.
Is that the Isabel Hayes
Yes,
piece?
I thought it was very
It was
interesting.
brilliant. Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah.
go on.
So, you know, there's been times, for example, I myself might have been driving along in my car or been privy to a conversation where it just makes you stop because of the level of detail that's involved in the discussion. And I often think then of the impact that might have on a victim survivor, um, both in terms of triggering them because it's come at them out of nowhere on a random day. But also, I think there's a very delicate balance in how the system is represented. So there are definitely faults in the system. There are a lot of them. The system is constantly improving. It's improved a lot in the years I've been working within it. And I do think it's incumbent on the media that they shine a light on the problems, but also that they acknowledge and highlight where improvements have been made. You know, that kind of idea of solutions journalism that you do, that it's not fatalistic. You don't want people seeing coverage of trials or coverage of the system that means they're just not going to come forward. And there's a very delicate balance, and that's a very hard job to do, and I don't underestimate that.
That's actually, if you
I
don't mind me interrupting
Yeah.
you there, that's a really fascinating point. And as someone who works as a journalist, um, in your fantastic piece of research, Words Matter, which we will be sharing with everyone, Susan did an amazing piece of research, which is very easy to read. That was one of the points that I actually had never thought about, and it leapt out at me. And I think what you said was that if the reporting is too fatalistic, victim survivors might be deterred from coming forward. So you're trying to strive for that balance, really, is what you're saying, being accurate, but if not being too fatalistic. Is that it?
Yeah, it is. And I suppose, ironically, I can be nervous of media, so I get approached a lot to speak on media, and sometimes I shy away from it. And sometimes what I found frustrating is that maybe I might have highlighted a good aspect of the system, and the comment isn't used, or the coverage isn't there. And I really have, there's been more recent times where I've asked, if I've given a comment, a journalist said, look, can you highlight that there's improvements here, or things have gotten better in recent years? And I have to say, when I've asked them to do it, they've done it, which is great. But you have to remember, like when you look at the CSO prevalence statistics, the high number of survivors that are in our country, many of whom have maybe never even told anybody, certainly have never gone to the criminal justice system. And you don't want the coverage of the system to be such that they're just not going to go forward. They're just not going to make a report. And look, I don't underestimate how hard that job is, but it's important that, you know, when you are covering the bad parts, that you offer some acknowledgement that improvements are being made. And some of that comes down to then taking commentary more widely. So that's another thing that I suppose struck me when I started really looking at media commentary. Who are the voices that are in the commentary? Who's asked for comment? Are voices being given equally to all support organizations? Is it the same few that are approached repeatedly? And there's wonderful national voices there, but there's wonderful regional voices that may be getting missed as well. And I suppose then just a final point, what has also concerned me is that victim survivors increasingly are speaking out, which is wonderful, but they are vulnerable when they do that. So I think about particularly there's countless now brave survivors who, after their cases have stood on the steps of the court and talked about their experience. They might be lauding the system because they got a sentence. They might be calling out the system because the system got it wrong. And their voices are really important. But I do wonder sometimes, is the machinery there to support them when they're doing that? So are they fully informed before they waive their anonymity? Is there a safety protocol in place, for example, for them to be ready for what might come from waiving your anonymity? Because I do think that maybe you think about, I'm going to speak to this journalist. I'm going to go on the steps of the court and speak today, and that'll be the end of it. But once you're there, you're going to get approached again by media. It stays with you for a long time. It stays with you indefinitely. Really, your anonymity is gone then. So part of the guidance, and one of the things that was really important for me going into this, is that maybe some of the protections that are within the criminal justice system for victim survivors would also be in the media landscape for them. So having a support person in place, having protocols around, have you thought about what you're going to do when this story comes out? Are they going to have some maybe that'll keep an eye on social media for you? Will you have someone read the story beforehand? If you've spoken to a victim survivor and maybe you're not going to use their material, or you're not going to use it to the extent they expect, have you come back to them and explained to them why that is? And that's really something that I feel really strongly about, because at the moment I'm putting through an ethics application for my current research project where I'm engaging with victim survivors, and the level of care that quite rightly is expected of me by my university, in which I wouldn't do this project without. It's really important that we see that when media, when any professional engages with victim survivors. And I think sometimes I do worry that maybe they mightn't be fully informed or fully prepared for what might come from talking to media.
So there really you're talking about a trauma-informed response, but you're
Yeah,
specifically talking about protocols, which are very important, and you would like to see those in the media landscape. There was
yeah,
one other thing as well that you mentioned earlier about when I asked you about the gaps, you said it's natural and perhaps inevitable that there would be episodic reporting and that there's choices made by media, which they will have to make about which cases to cover. But one of the things that struck me in your research is that you pointed out that a way to give a broader context, because you do in a media room, an editor will make a choice about we're going with that case. And then you've made your choice about the very important protocols. But a way that you said maybe to give a broader context to the issue is to root it in statistics. Wasn't that one of the
yeah.
things?
Yeah, so an awareness of statistics. I also think using statistics carefully, because I have spoken to researchers or even state agencies over the years that have said, look, we did loads of great work, and the only thing that got highlighted was where we got it wrong. The stat or the headline misrepresented the work we did, or maybe the stat is used out of context. I think that's important to always ground. If you're using a statistic or you're relying on a statistic, that you're doing it responsibly. And again, that comes back to the solutions-based journalism, or you're getting a comment on it. And I suppose the other thing then about the episodic reporting, and one of the things that I did in this, in my guidance, was to create, I suppose I created a calendar of awareness days where media could plan for coverage. So I appreciate the news cycle, and it's so difficult now, the pressure that's on journalists now to get news out in such a hurry. But there are ways you could plan. There are days every year, every month, where you could plan for targeted coverage on a specific issue. Look at it from a satellite level. So, for example, are you covering all victims of sexual violence? Is everyone being represented in your coverage? Is there a space where you could plan a theme for International Women's Day or Sexual Violence Awareness Month, or whatever the case may be, to plan coverage? It gives you the time to like those wonderful investigative pieces we see from time to time in different media outlets, to plan like that around sexual violence, to really shine a light, because cases don't tend to get linked up together. And then what people know might be what they tune into on a given day or a given week.
You also mentioned as well there, just, in passing the word headlines, and that's something that pops up very much in your research about the notion of the importance of headlines. Could you just kind of expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, and I think headlines actually is really important because, and one of the things that if anyone who reads my guidance might note that I did note in some guidance that it speaks about journalists more so than editors. And I can see how journalists quite rightly might feel a little bit annoyed when they're being called out for a headline they didn't write because that it'll be a sub editor perhaps that's written the headline. The headline may not always represent the story they've written. The headline might take a particular angle that doesn't represent maybe always what they had intended. But we do know that a lot of people will just read the headline. And there are some key things that are done in headlines that again are common journalistic practice about, to catch attention, words that are used that are problematic because they do feed into broader stereotypes. So the idea that you zone in on a perpetrator, they tend to either be portrayed as the monster, so the monsterification of the perpetrator, or the ordinary decent look, the great sports person, the family man, and both are problematic. The monsterification, actually, though it may be seen as a good thing because it's calling out the horror of sexual violence, actually can do more harm than good because it kind of creates an othering of our uniqueness around people who perpetrate sexual violence, and we know that often they're the very ordinary. They're the person that's known to the survivor. There's an ordinariness to all of this that these words like beast and monster, they just don't reflect it. And it's not always helpful, even though I don't think the intention is bad. And likewise in how you portray things like, OGAA, star for it, whatever it might be, that can be received as, oh, well, look, sure, they're actually a really decent fella, a really decent person that just got caught up in all of this. So it's to be really mindful of how, in the context of sexual violence, what might be very innocuous phrasing, seemingly, or might be seen to be actually doing a good thing, can actually have quite the reverse consequence. And it does strike me that, the normal ways we do our jobs have to change when you're in the space of sexual violence. So, for example, the normal way a barrister might question a witness. So it's not that they necessarily question are worse to in a sexual offence trial. It might be the way they always question a witness, but it's inherently more problematic when it's a sexual offence trial. So we have to do our jobs differently.
So I have like a ton of questions, and I'd like to keep here all day, so I'm going to have to be selective. In your research, you looked at, because it's just you're touching on so many interesting things, and we could run down loads of roads with those. But I know you looked at you did comparative work, and you looked at other jurisdictions. So, are there any particular jurisdictions? And you referenced this at the start about there are guidance, or rule books, if you like. Any ones that stand out to you in the area of sexual violence that you think they did a good job in constructing guidelines?
In truth, a lot of the guidance is very similar. So we all
Okay.
say similar things.
Mm.
What makes the difference is how it's implemented. So I would say, and the research on this, there has been research done on guidance and how it lands, and what makes the difference is the implementation. So really interesting methods of implementation I have seen is actually not training in a didactic way where someone like me goes in and wags the finger and talks to someone about how to do it, but going in and sitting down at media and saying, a really meaning, and I can't remember what jurisdiction I saw, but I thought it was really meaningful that someone like myself, or or an NGO with experience in the area, went into a newsroom and they spoke to the people in the newsroom, and then those people shared what they'd written, and these are articles I've written. Can you tell me from your perspective what I might have got right or what I might have got wrong, in a very open and, I suppose, collaborative way. And then to maybe go back again and say, well, look, I've tried now to take on board what you're saying, or you reach back out to the organization afterwards, that it's no one wagging the finger at anyone else, that it's a collaborative, because I think what sometimes can happen is we're shouting from the edges at each other. So maybe someone like me being very critical of media because I don't understand how the media do their job, or I haven't explained properly why a particular word is problematic or why a particular practice is problematic. So I think that dialogue is important. And also there's a really interesting group in the UK that I spoke to when I was completing this research. I think they're called Angles, but how they operate is they train groups of people with lived experience to engage with media. So it could be people who've experienced homelessness, people who've experienced grief, people who've experienced sexual violence. They're trained to engage with the media, and media can come to Angles and say, look, it might be BBC, and they're going to have.
You're muted there.
Sorry, they might have a storyline in a soap opera, for example, and they want to speak to people. The lived experience group know how to do that safely for themselves, and the media have the advantage of being able to come and get that experience.
That's very interesting, Susan. We might ask you for that again if you think of it, if it's Angles, and we look it up ourselves.
Yeah.
I'm actually going to, as I said, I've tons more questions for you, but I'm going to hand you over now to our CEO, Madeleine, who will handle a Q&A, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks, Sarah. Before we go to the Q&A, I'll just tell you about the speaker next week, who is Sonia McMullen, and she's the Regional Manager in Women's Aid Federation Northern Ireland. And she was involved in writing media reporting guidelines in Northern Ireland called Responsible Reporting Matters. And then after that, we will have Jane Gilmore. She's a writer, a journalist, and an activist, and the founder of Fixed It. So very interesting speakers coming up, which is great. So all of our Lunch and Learns are recorded and posted on our YouTube channel. You can find out more about Haven Horizons on our website, and you can stay up to date with all the things we're doing on our social media platforms. And just following up there on what Susan said, our whole approach is collaborative partnerships. So that really ties in with what you're saying. The prevention approach needs collaboration and collaborative partnerships. And these Lunch and Learn series are kindly sponsored by the Shared Island Civic Society Fund from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And they like us to say that the ideas and opinions and comments from the presenters in the events are entirely the responsibility of the presenters. And that project is run as a partnership with our Northern Ireland partner, Belfast and Lisburn Women's Aid. And I see Noelle here from Belfast and Lisburn Women's Aid. So we'll stop recording now, and we'll open it up for questions if anyone has any questions for Susan. Thank you for watching.